My aunt called me at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, her voice a whisper, telling me that if I didn't come get her within the hour, she genuinely believed she might never leave the building she was calling from at all. 18 hours earlier, my Aunt Diane had been sitting at her own kitchen table, sharp, independent, and completely, unmistakably in her right mind, the same woman she had been for the 67 years of her life up to that point. By that Tuesday night, she was a locked-ward psychiatric patient at a private behavioral health facility outside Phoenix, admitted under an emergency involuntary hold, based on a signed psychiatric certification claiming she posed an imminent danger to herself, unable to leave, unable to make a single phone call without staff supervision, watching, in real time, as a court hearing she had no advance knowledge of was being scheduled to grant her own son, my cousin Gregory, full emergency guardianship over her entire estate. I drove 3 hours through the night to reach that facility, and it took me another 11 days, a mental health rights attorney, an independent forensic psychiatric evaluation, and a habeas corpus petition to get my aunt released from a hold that should never have been placed on her in the first place. A hold built entirely on a fraudulent psychiatric certification signed by a Dr. Gregory had specifically sought out and paid. A doctor who, we would eventually discover, had done exactly this for at least 4 other families before mine. If you're new here, welcome to Family Hidden Fight, where we tell you the truth about the wars fought behind closed doors, inside families, including, in today's story, a war fought behind a locked psychiatric ward door against a system specifically designed to protect genuinely vulnerable people, weaponized instead against a woman who was never vulnerable at all. Today's story is called The Papers That Said She Was Unfit. Let's begin. My name is Vanessa Ortiz. I'm 39 years old, I work as a nurse practitioner in Tucson, and my aunt, Diane Prescott, is 67 years old, a retired accountant who spent 38 years running her own small tax preparation business before selling it and retiring roughly 4 years before this story begins, following the death of her husband, my Uncle Robert, from pancreatic cancer. I want to be clear, from the very beginning of this story, about the specific, essential fact that makes everything that follows so genuinely disturbing. My Aunt Diane was not, at any point relevant to this story, experiencing any kind of genuine mental health crisis, cognitive decline, or condition that would remotely justify the emergency psychiatric intervention that was ultimately, fraudulently used against her. She was, throughout this entire ordeal, exactly the same sharp, independent, financially astute woman she had been for her entire adult life. A woman who had, as recently as the week before this story begins, been managing her own considerable retirement portfolio, volunteering weekly at a local literacy nonprofit, and maintaining an active, engaged social life among a close circle of longtime friends. My aunt's estate, following my uncle's death and the sale of her accounting business, was worth roughly $1.6 million, a figure that, I want to be honest, becomes directly relevant to understanding exactly what motivated the events that followed, though I want to establish clearly, from the outset, that my aunt's own capacity to manage that estate was never genuinely, legitimately in question at any point. My cousin Gregory, my aunt's only child, is 43 years old, and had, in the years following my uncle's death, developed what I understood, at the time, as an ordinary, if perhaps somewhat closer than typical, involvement in helping his mother navigate the practical logistics of widowhood, accompanying her to some financial appointments, helping coordinate home maintenance, the kind of ordinary, supportive adult-child involvement that, on its own, raised no particular concern from me or from the rest of our extended family. I want to describe the specific, gradually escalating tension that had developed between Diane and Gregory in the weeks leading up to this story's central crisis, because understanding this context matters enormously to understanding what actually motivated Gregory's eventual, drastic actions. Diane had, roughly 6 weeks before the events of this story, informed Gregory of her intention to make a significant charitable donation, approximately $400,000, a substantial, but, given her overall estate's value, genuinely sustainable portion of her retirement savings. to establish a literacy scholarship fund through the nonprofit organization where she'd volunteered for several years, a decision she described, when she later recounted it to me, as reflecting a genuine, long-considered desire to create a lasting, meaningful legacy connected to a cause she'd grown genuinely passionate about following her retirement. Gregory had, according to Diane's own account and later corroborated through several other family members' independent observations, reacted to this planned donation with considerable, escalating alarm and opposition, expressing concern, at least in his initial framing, about whether this specific donation might leave his mother's own remaining retirement security insufficiently protected. A concern that, on its face, might have reflected genuine, reasonable filial worry. Except that Diane's own careful, independent financial planning, which she'd reviewed thoroughly with her own longtime financial advisor before ever informing Gregory of her decision, had already established that the donation represented a genuinely sustainable, well-considered portion of her overall estate. He kept pushing and pushing in a way that started to feel less like genuine concern and more like something else entirely, Diane told me, once she was finally able to describe this period to me in full detail. By the third or fourth conversation about it, he wasn't really asking questions about my financial planning anymore. He was telling me, flatly, that I wasn't thinking clearly, that this decision reflected exactly the kind of impulsive thinking he'd been noticing in me lately, language that genuinely confused me at the time, because I had absolutely no idea what specific behavior he was even referring to. I want to walk through, as precisely and carefully as I've been able to reconstruct through Diane's own account and the subsequent formal legal investigation, exactly what happened on the day Gregory orchestrated her involuntary psychiatric commitment. Gregory arrived at Diane's home on an ordinary Monday afternoon, ostensibly for a routine visit, accompanied, Diane would later realize, by a man he introduced simply as a friend who's a doctor. A physician named Dr. Alan Voss, who Diane understood at the time to be present for a casual, social visit rather than any kind of formal medical evaluation. Over the following roughly 90 minutes, according to Diane's own detailed account, Dr. Voss engaged her in what felt, at the time, like ordinary, if somewhat unusually probing, conversation, questions about her sleep patterns, her mood, her recent decision-making, questions Diane answered honestly and without particular concern, having no reason at the time to understand that this conversation was actually functioning as an informal, unconsented psychiatric evaluation rather than the casual social interaction it had been presented to her as. Roughly 2 hours after this conversation concluded, 2 crisis intervention specialists arrived at Diane's home, presenting her with a signed emergency psychiatric hold certification, completed by Dr. Voss, asserting, in language Diane would only fully understand and process once she'd obtained her own copy of the documentation days later, that she presented a demonstrated, imminent risk of harm to herself, based on Dr. Voss's clinical assessment of significantly impaired judgment, evidenced by impulsive major financial decision-making, combined with mood symptoms consistent with a possible major depressive episode with associated cognitive impairment. I genuinely did not understand, in that first hour, what was actually happening to me, Diane told me, describing this specific moment. I kept trying to explain that I felt completely fine, that there was some kind of enormous misunderstanding, and the more I tried to advocate for myself, calmly and clearly, the more the crisis team seemed to interpret that calm, clear advocacy as further evidence of exactly the kind of impaired insight Dr. Voss's certification had already described. I felt like I was trapped inside some kind of impossible logical loop, where literally any response I gave was being interpreted as further confirmation of a diagnosis I knew, with complete certainty, didn't actually apply to me. I want to describe receiving Diane's late-night call, roughly 18 hours after her initial commitment, because it remains, even now, one of the most genuinely frightening phone calls I've ever received in my entire life. Diane had, according to her own account, been permitted limited, supervised phone access roughly 18 hours into her hold, a call she'd specifically used to reach me rather than any other family member. Given, she later explained, her specific awareness of my own professional background as a nurse practitioner, hoping I might understand and be able to help navigate the medical and legal systems involved more effectively than other family members without healthcare experience might. Vanessa, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to believe me completely, Diane said, her voice a careful, controlled whisper I understood, immediately reflected genuine fear about being overheard by facility staff. I am not having any kind of mental health crisis. I am being held here against my will, based on some kind of fraudulent evaluation Gregory arranged, and I don't fully understand yet what he's actually trying to accomplish. But I need you to get me a lawyer, and I need you to do it tonight, because I genuinely don't know how long they're planning to keep me here, or what might happen to my finances while I'm trapped in here unable to advocate for myself. I want to describe the specific, disorienting horror of receiving this call, understanding, immediately and completely, that my aunt, a woman I had known my entire life as unfailingly sharp, calm, and completely, reliably rational, was describing a situation genuinely consistent with a wrongful, fraudulent psychiatric commitment orchestrated by her own son, for reasons I couldn't yet fully understand but that I immediately, instinctively connected to the ongoing tension over her planned charitable donation. I drove to the facility that same night, arriving roughly 2 hours later, only to be informed, upon arrival, that visiting hours had concluded, and that I would not be permitted to see Diane until the following morning. A delay that, I want to be honest, produced a specific, escalating panic about what might happen to her, and to her broader financial situation. During those additional hours, I was unable to directly intervene. I want to describe what I discovered the following morning, once I was finally able to speak with Diane's assigned social worker at the facility, and separately, began independently investigating the broader legal situation. Gregory had, on the same day he arranged Diane's psychiatric commitment, filed an emergency petition in probate court seeking temporary guardianship over Diane's entire estate, citing, as the primary supporting evidence for this petition, the same fraudulent psychiatric certification Dr. Voss had produced. Arizona law, like most states, provides a legitimate, genuinely important legal mechanism for exactly this kind of emergency guardianship petition, designed to protect genuinely incapacitated individuals whose immediate safety or financial security might be at risk during the period before a fuller, more thorough capacity evaluation and hearing can be conducted. A legitimate, important legal tool that Gregory had, in this specific instance, deliberately, fraudulently weaponized against a mother who possessed no genuine incapacity whatsoever. I retained, immediately upon understanding the full scope of what was happening, a mental health and disability rights attorney, a specialist named Patricia Alvarez, who explained, during our first, urgent consultation, the specific legal mechanisms available to challenge exactly this kind of wrongful commitment and fraudulent guardianship petition. I want to be direct with you about the urgency here, Patricia told me during that first call. We need to move immediately on 2 separate, simultaneous fronts, filing a habeas corpus petition specifically challenging the legal validity of your aunt's involuntary psychiatric hold, and separately, formally contesting the emergency guardianship petition Gregory has filed, providing the court with independent evidence establishing your aunt's actual, genuine competency. Both of these need to happen as quickly as possible, because every additional day your aunt remains held against her will, and every additional day passes before the guardianship petition is properly contested, makes Gregory's underlying position, however fraudulent, incrementally harder to fully unwind. I want to walk through the specific legal process Patricia pursued to secure Diane's release, because I think understanding this specific, powerful legal mechanism matters genuinely to anyone who might, someday, find themselves needing to challenge a similarly wrongful psychiatric commitment. Habeas corpus, Patricia explained, represents one of the oldest and most fundamental legal protections within American law, providing any individual held against their will, in any context, the right to have a court promptly, independently review the legal basis for that confinement. A protection that, Patricia noted, applies with particular, specific force to psychiatric commitments. Given the genuinely serious civil liberties implications of involuntarily confining someone based on a psychiatric evaluation that, in Diane's specific case, appeared to have been fraudulently constructed from the very beginning. Patricia filed the habeas corpus petition within 24 hours of my initial consultation with her, requesting an expedited hearing, specifically challenging the legal validity of Dr. Voss's underlying certification, supported by a detailed affidavit from me, describing my own professional clinical assessment as a nurse practitioner with genuine mental health evaluation experience, of Diane's actual presentation and functioning during the limited phone, and eventually in-person contact I'd been able to have with her since her commitment began. The court granted an expedited hearing, held roughly 4 days after Diane's initial commitment, at which Patricia successfully argued that Dr. Voss's underlying certification failed to meet the legal standard required for involuntary psychiatric commitment, given the genuine absence of any documented, specific evidence of imminent self-harm risk. Relying instead, Patricia argued forcefully, on a fundamentally inappropriate characterization of an ordinary, considered financial and charitable decision as evidence of psychiatric impairment. The presiding judge, reviewing both Dr. Voss's original certification and Patricia's detailed legal challenge, ordered an immediate, independent psychiatric evaluation to be conducted by a court-appointed, entirely independent evaluator with no prior connection to Gregory, Dr. Voss, or the facility currently holding Diane. A ruling that, while not yet securing Diane's full, immediate release, represented a genuinely significant, hopeful legal victory in establishing that her commitment's underlying legal basis was, at minimum, seriously, legitimately in question. I want to describe the independent psychiatric evaluation itself, conducted by a court-appointed geriatric psychiatrist, Dr. Helena Cho, roughly 6 days into Diane's commitment. An evaluation Patricia had specifically, carefully prepared Diane for, given how genuinely disorienting and frightening the entire preceding week had already proven to be. I want you to understand something important about how to approach this evaluation, Patricia told Diane during a preparation call the day before Dr. Cho's assessment. I know you're understandably angry and frightened, and I know your instinct might be to become defensive or emotionally intense when discussing what's happened to you this past week. I need you to understand that emotional intensity, in this specific evaluative context, however completely justified and understandable, can unfortunately sometimes be misread by an evaluator as further evidence of instability, the same fundamental trap that seems to have characterized your original, fraudulent evaluation with Dr. Voss. I need you to try to present as calmly and factually as possible, even though I completely understand how difficult that's going to be, given everything you've just been through. Dr. Cho's evaluation, conducted over roughly 2 hours, involved a comprehensive clinical assessment considerably more thorough and methodologically sound than whatever brief, informal conversation Dr. Voss had originally conducted, standardized cognitive assessment tools, a detailed clinical interview, and critically, a careful, independent review of Diane's actual, documented financial decision-making history, including consultation with her longtime independent financial advisor regarding the specific charitable donation Gregory had characterized as evidence of impaired judgment. Dr. Cho's written report, submitted to the court roughly 3 days after the evaluation, was unambiguous and genuinely devastating to Gregory's underlying position. Diane demonstrated fully intact cognitive function, no evidence whatsoever of any major depressive episode or associated impairment, and regarding the specific charitable donation decision, Dr. Cho's report explicitly noted that the decision, once properly understood in context, reflected entirely rational, well-considered financial and philanthropic planning, consistent with the patient's documented long-term values and financial capacity, showing no indication whatsoever of impaired judgment or impulsivity. Based on Dr. Cho's independent findings, the court ordered Diane's immediate release from the psychiatric hold, a ruling that came roughly 11 days after her initial, fraudulent commitment. 11 days that, I want to be honest, represented some of the most genuinely traumatic experiences of my aunt's entire life, an experience she has since described, in her own words, as the single most powerless, terrifying period I have ever lived through, made worse by the specific, devastating knowledge that my own son had deliberately orchestrated it. I drove to the facility to bring Diane home myself on the day of her release, and I want to describe what that reunion actually felt like. Not the relatively clean, triumphant moment a simple description of release might suggest, but something considerably more raw and complicated. My aunt visibly shaken, exhausted, and processing, in real time, the specific, profound betrayal of understanding exactly what her own son had done to her, and why. I keep trying to understand how he could actually do this to me, Diane told me, during the drive home, her voice still carrying a specific, raw quality I hadn't heard from her before this entire ordeal began. Not just the guardianship petition, which I could almost understand as some kind of misguided, if genuinely wrong, attempt to protect what he saw as his eventual inheritance, but the actual psychiatric hold, Vanessa. He had me locked in a facility, unable to leave, unable to make my own decisions, unable to even fully understand what was happening to me for 11 days. I don't know how a person does that to their own mother. I want to describe what Patricia's continued investigation revealed about Dr. Alan Voss, the psychiatrist whose fraudulent certification had made Diane's entire wrongful commitment possible. Because understanding his broader pattern of conduct became genuinely important to the subsequent legal and licensing accountability our family ultimately pursued. Dr. Voss, we discovered, maintained a private psychiatric practice that, on its surface, appeared entirely legitimate and properly licensed. But that, according to a pattern Patricia's investigation uncovered through a combination of Arizona Medical Board records, and eventually, several other affected families who came forward once our own case attracted some regional attention, had developed a specific, documented reputation within a narrow but genuinely concerning circle. As a psychiatrist willing to produce exactly this kind of fraudulent emergency commitment certification, for a fee, specifically to family members seeking to gain rapid guardianship control over an aging or estranged relative's assets. I want you to understand the specific, calculated cruelty of what Dr. Voss's broader pattern actually represents, Patricia explained, once this fuller picture had emerged. He's not simply a psychiatrist who made a single, isolated error in clinical judgment regarding your aunt's case. He's someone who appears to have developed a specific, ongoing business practice around exactly this kind of fraudulent certification, understanding precisely how the emergency commitment and guardianship systems genuine, important protections for actually vulnerable people could be weaponized against people who aren't vulnerable at all, provided a family member was willing to pay for his specific, willing complicity. Patricia's investigation ultimately connected Dr. Voss's pattern to at least 4 other confirmed families, each describing a strikingly similar sequence of events. A family member seeking his services specifically to facilitate rapid guardianship control over an aging relative's assets, followed by a brief, informal evaluation Dr. Voss would then certify as demonstrating imminent psychiatric risk, regardless of the actual underlying clinical reality. Patricia, working alongside our family, filed a formal complaint against Dr. Voss with the Arizona Medical Board, supported by Dr. Cho's independent evaluation directly contradicting his original certification, alongside the broader pattern of similar complaints from the other affected families Patricia's investigation had identified. The medical board's own investigation, conducted over the following several months, ultimately resulted in the suspension of Dr. Voss's medical license, based on findings that he had engaged in a documented, repeated pattern of fraudulent psychiatric certification, specifically facilitating unauthorized guardianship proceedings. Findings that, notably, also referenced the broader pattern the other affected families had corroborated, establishing that Diane's case, however individually devastating, reflected part of a considerably larger, sustained pattern of professional misconduct, rather than any isolated clinical error. I want to describe something Patricia told me, once this licensing outcome had been achieved, that offered genuinely important context about the specific legal and professional accountability landscape governing exactly this category of misconduct. I want to be honest that professional licensing consequences, while genuinely significant, don't always fully address the underlying harm in cases like this, Patricia explained. Dr. Voss's license suspension prevents him from continuing this specific pattern of misconduct going forward, which matters enormously for future potential victims. But it doesn't, on its own, provide your aunt with the kind of full, direct accountability a criminal prosecution or civil judgment might provide. We pursued the licensing complaint as one important piece of the broader accountability puzzle, alongside the separate civil and criminal proceedings against both Dr. Voss and Gregory that we're continuing to pursue. Diane, working with Patricia, pursued both criminal referral and civil legal action against Gregory and Dr. Voss jointly, given the clear, coordinated nature of their fraudulent scheme. The criminal referral, submitted to the county prosecutor's office, alleged charges including fraud connected to the fabricated psychiatric certification and, separately, unlawful imprisonment, given the genuine, documented deprivation of Diane's liberty. The fraudulent commitment had produced charges that, roughly 8 months after the initial referral, resulted in Gregory pleading guilty to a reduced set of charges, receiving a sentence including probation and a formal restitution order. Alongside a specific, court-mandated no-contact provision, preventing him from any involvement in Diane's ongoing financial or medical affairs going forward. A legal protection Diane specifically requested, and that the court granted, given the clear, documented pattern of exactly this kind of exploitation his prior conduct had established. Dr. Voss faced separate criminal charges, given his direct, professional role in fabricating the underlying psychiatric certification that had made the entire scheme possible, ultimately resulting in his own guilty plea to charges including fraud and conspiracy, alongside a sentence that, given the broader pattern of similar misconduct affecting multiple families, reflected considerably more severe consequences than Gregory's own individual sentence. The separate civil action, pursued primarily to recover Diane's own legal expenses and to formally establish, through civil judgment, the full documented harm this wrongful commitment and guardianship attempt had caused, resulted in a negotiated settlement providing Diane meaningful financial compensation. Though I want to be honest, echoing sentiments expressed in several other stories on this channel, that no financial settlement could ever fully, adequately compensate for the genuine, profound trauma of 11 days spent wrongfully, involuntarily confined based on her own son's deliberate, calculated fraud. I want to describe, honestly, where Diane's relationship with Gregory currently stands, roughly 2 years after this entire ordeal began, because I think the specific, genuinely severe nature of what Gregory did, not simply financial exploitation. However serious, but the deliberate, calculated deprivation of his own mother's fundamental liberty has produced a considerably more complete, if painful, estrangement than several of the more gradually rebuilt relationships described in other stories on this channel. I don't think I will ever be able to have any kind of meaningful relationship with him again, Diane told me during a recent conversation, roughly 2 years into this ongoing process. I've thought about this more than almost anything else in my entire life, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. What he did wasn't a mistake or a moment of poor judgment born from genuine, if misguided, concern. He deliberately, calculatedly arranged to have me locked away, against my will, specifically so he could seize control of my own finances before I could complete a charitable donation he simply didn't want me to make. I don't know how to build any kind of relationship on top of that specific, fundamental betrayal, and I've decided I'm not going to try. I want to respect and honor Diane's own, clearly articulated position on this question, understanding, based on everything this entire ordeal revealed about the specific, severe nature of Gregory's calculated conduct, that her choice to maintain complete distance reflects a genuinely reasonable, well-considered response to exactly the kind of fundamental violation of trust and liberty this story has described, a different, and I think entirely legitimate, path than the more gradual. Patient rebuilding, some other families featured on this channel, have chosen to pursue with family members who cause them serious, if somewhat differently structured, harm. I want to describe something genuinely meaningful that occurred roughly 3 months after Diane's release and the initial resolution of the urgent legal proceedings. Her formal completion of the exact charitable donation that had originally triggered Gregory's entire fraudulent scheme. Diane established, formally and with full, careful legal documentation this time, the literacy scholarship fund she had originally intended to create, donating the full $400,000 she had always planned to contribute, a decision she described, once finally able to complete it, as carrying a specific, meaningful significance well beyond its practical philanthropic impact. I needed to actually do this, exactly the way I originally planned, once I was finally free to make my own decisions again, Diane told me, at the small dedication ceremony the literacy nonprofit organized once the scholarship fund was formally established. Not as some kind of act of defiance against Gregory, though I won't pretend that element isn't present too. Mostly because this was always genuinely what I wanted to do with this portion of my own life's savings, and I refused to let what he did to me permanently take away my own right to make that decision, the exact decision he tried so hard and so wrongfully to prevent. The scholarship fund, now named the Robert and Diane Prescott Literacy Scholarship, in honor of both Diane and her late husband, has, in the roughly 18 months since its establishment, provided educational support to 11 students pursuing literacy and education-focused degree programs, a genuinely meaningful, permanent legacy that exists today. Specifically because Diane refused to let a fraudulent psychiatric commitment permanently take away her own fundamental right to determine how she wanted to spend her own life's carefully built resources. I want to describe connecting with 2 of the other families Patricia's investigation, identified as having experienced Dr. Voss's same fraudulent pattern, because their own, separately devastating experiences added important, sobering context to our understanding of the full scope of what he had built. The Ferraro family, whose own elderly patriarch had been wrongfully committed roughly 3 years before Diane's own case, described an outcome considerably less favorable than our own. Their father, unlike Diane, had genuinely developed some degree of mild, age-related cognitive change in the years since his original wrongful commitment, a development that, his daughter Angela told me, made it genuinely difficult, in retrospect, to fully separate what had originally been fraudulent from whatever genuine changes had occurred in the years since, complicating their own family's path toward full accountability and resolution. I think about how different things might have gone if we'd caught it as quickly as your family did, Angela told me, during a difficult, honest conversation. My father spent almost 3 weeks committed before we finally got him out, and I've always wondered whether that specific trauma and the stress of the entire ordeal might have actually accelerated whatever cognitive changes eventually did develop, even though there's obviously no way to prove that connection definitively. It's a specific kind of grief, wondering whether the fraud itself might have caused some of the very decline it originally, falsely claimed already existed. I want to include Angela's account here, because I think it illustrates an important, sobering reality about exactly this kind of fraud. The genuine, severe trauma of wrongful psychiatric commitment carries real, potential long-term health consequences. Well beyond the more immediate legal and financial harm this story has primarily focused on, a consideration that adds further weight to understanding exactly how serious and consequential Dr. Voss's broader pattern of misconduct actually proved to be across every family he affected. I want to return to Patricia Alvarez, our attorney, because a broader conversation I had with her, near the conclusion of our case's primary legal proceedings, offered genuinely important, systemic context about the specific vulnerabilities within emergency psychiatric commitment law that allowed this kind of fraud to occur. I want you to understand something important about why cases like your aunt's remain possible, even with the genuine, important legal protections our system does provide, Patricia told me. Emergency psychiatric holds are specifically designed to allow rapid, decisive intervention in genuine crisis situations, which means the legal threshold for an initial certification is intentionally lower than what would be required for, say, a formal criminal conviction. That's appropriate and necessary for the system's legitimate protective purpose, but it also creates a specific window of vulnerability in the initial hours and days of a hold before the more rigorous, independent review process. The kind Dr. Cho eventually provided in your aunt's case has had time to actually occur. A corrupt, willing psychiatrist can exploit exactly that window, knowing that even a fraudulent certification will trigger a genuine, if temporary, deprivation of liberty before independent review can catch up and correct it. I asked Patricia whether she saw specific, meaningful reforms that might help close this vulnerability going forward. I think there's a genuine, ongoing conversation within the mental health law field about requiring faster, more automatic independent review triggers, rather than relying entirely on family members knowing to seek out specialized legal counsel and habeas corpus relief on their own initiative. The way your family, fortunately, had the knowledge and resources to do relatively quickly, she said. Not every family facing this situation has a nurse practitioner niece with the professional background and immediate instinct to recognize exactly what was happening and how urgently to respond. I think stories like your aunt's, shared publicly, play a genuinely important role in helping other families recognize the pattern and know to seek exactly this kind of specialized help immediately, rather than losing precious time not fully understanding what legal options actually exist. I want to describe how Diane herself has, in the roughly 2 years since this ordeal concluded, become an active, committed advocate for mental health and guardianship reform. A path she pursued, she's told me, specifically because she wanted something genuinely meaningful to emerge from an experience that had otherwise cost her so much. Diane began, roughly a year after her release, speaking publicly, through a combination of local advocacy events and, eventually, testimony before a state legislative committee exploring potential guardianship and emergency commitment reform legislation, sharing her own detailed, first-hand account of exactly what had happened to her, specifically to help legislators and the broader public understand the genuine, practical vulnerability her case had exposed within the existing system. I never expected, at 67 years old, to become the kind of person who testifies in front of a legislative committee, Diane told me after her first such appearance. But I kept thinking about the other families Patricia identified, and about how many more families might be out there who haven't yet had the resources or the knowledge to fight back the way we were fortunate enough to. If sharing my own story, however difficult and exposing that feels, might help even one other family avoid what happened to me, or help them fight back more quickly and effectively than I initially knew how to, then I think it's worth the discomfort of telling it publicly. Diane's testimony, alongside similar accounts from several of the other affected families, ultimately contributed to a legislative reform package, passed roughly 18 months after our own case concluded, strengthening Arizona's requirements for independent psychiatric review timelines, and separately, establishing new penalties specifically targeting exactly this kind of fraudulent certification scheme. A genuinely meaningful, systemic legacy emerging from an experience that had, at its core, been about one family's specific, devastating betrayal. For every family, NAVIGATING guardianship or psychiatric evaluation concerns. If you're watching this and you or someone you love is currently facing, or might someday face, a family member's attempt to pursue guardianship or emergency psychiatric evaluation, I want to say something directly to you, informed by everything this genuinely disturbing ordeal taught my own family. Emergency psychiatric commitment and guardianship proceedings exist to protect genuinely vulnerable people, and I want to be careful, in sharing this story, not to suggest these legal mechanisms are themselves inherently suspect or dangerous. The overwhelming majority of psychiatric evaluations and guardianship proceedings, conducted by genuinely ethical, careful professionals, serve exactly the protective purpose they're intended to serve. But precisely because these mechanisms carry such genuinely significant, immediate legal power to restrict someone's liberty and financial autonomy, they are also, unfortunately, vulnerable to exactly the kind of deliberate, calculated fraud my aunt experienced. When a family member is willing to seek out and pay for a psychiatrist willing to fabricate the underlying evidence. If you ever receive a call, as I did, from a family member describing an involuntary psychiatric hold they believe is fraudulent or wrongfully applied, act immediately and decisively. Retain a mental health and disability rights attorney specifically, rather than a general family law attorney, given the specific, urgent legal mechanisms, habeas corpus petitions, expedited independent evaluation requests, that this specific category of situation requires. And understand that time is genuinely critical in exactly this kind of case, given how quickly a fraudulent commitment can be used to establish an emergency guardianship that becomes considerably harder to fully unwind the longer it remains in place. My Aunt Diane spent 11 days of her life wrongfully, fraudulently confined, based entirely on her own son's calculated decision to weaponize a system genuinely designed to protect vulnerable people against a mother who was never vulnerable at all. She is, today, fully free, fully independent, and has completed exactly the meaningful charitable legacy Gregory tried so wrongfully to prevent. Proof, I hope, that even the most calculated, devastating betrayal doesn't have to permanently define what comes after it. My name is Vanessa Ortiz, and this has been another family hidden fight. If this story reminded you of a guardianship concern, a psychiatric evaluation question, or any situation in your own family that made you worry about someone's genuine autonomy being at risk, don't wait to seek qualified legal guidance. Tell us your own story in the comments. It might become a future episode. Subscribe for a new family hidden fight story every week, and we'll see you in the next one.